We continue now at the top of Daf Samach Zayin Amud Aleph and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 67a. On the previous summit, Rava said that May Ruach Hektish, if the pile of grain is smoothed over and it was owned by Hektish at that time, so then Potter, then it's exempt from Trumas and Maisris. May Ruach Ovid Kochavim, when it's smoothed over, it's owned by Ovid Kochavim, it's owned by an idolater, so then it's a Machlokes Tanoim. And Rava now continues, Gilgul Hektish, let's say the dough is mixed when it is Hektish, so Potter, that exempts, it's not Chayiv and Chala in such a situation. The Tanan, as we learned in a Mishnah, Hikdisha Isasa Achalo Gilgula, if the dough was hektish before it was mixed to Padasa and then it's redeemed, so then Chayeves, then it's going to be Chayev and Chala, because at the time of the mixing of the dough it's not hektish. Misha Gilgula Uptoasa Chayeves, let's say after it's mixed, so then it becomes hektish and then it's redeemed, also it's Chayev, because again, when it was mixed it was Biyad Hedyot. But Hikdisha Achalo Gilgula, let's say it was sanctified before it was mixed, the Gilgula Hagizbor, and then the treasurer of the Beis HaMikdash, he mixed the dough, meaning to say at the time that it was owned by Hektish, that's when the dough was mixed. The Achar Kach Piduasa, and then it was redeemed, Petura, then it is Potter, Shebeshas Chovasa, Haisa Petura, because at the time that the obligation sets in, that's when it was exempt, and so therefore it's clear from this Mishnah that Gilgul Hektish is Potter. And the Gemara continues, Boy, Rava does ask the following question. Gilgul Ovid Kochavim, what if the dough is mixed at the time that it's owned by an Ovid Kochavim? What's the halach in that situation? Is it exempt or not? Mishnah Tanan, we learned in a Mishnah, this is a Mishnah also in Chala, Gershin Iskayer, if a Ger, he converts, Vahaisalo, Isan, he has dough, Nasa Ad Shalom Iskayer. Now, if the dough was mixed before he was Megayer, so then Potter, then he's exempt. Mishin Iskayer, but if it was mixed after he was Megayer, after he converted, so then Chayev, then there's an obligation of Chala. And Safek, let's say it's a situation of doubt, so Chayev, we're strict, and we say Chayev. And so clearly in this Mishnah it's saying that Gilgul Ovid Kochavim is Potter, but the question is, Haman Kotani Lo, who is the author of this Mishnah? On the one hand, we can say Divrei HaKolhi, we could say that this is everybody's opinion, meaning Vafilu Rabbi Meir of Rabbi Yehuda to come Chayiv Yasam, even Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, they were the Tanaim who said Chayiv in the situation of Trumas and Maisris, in a situation where the pile of grain was smoothed out, Biyad Ovid Kochavim, they said Chayiv, but Patri Hacha, maybe they would say over here, in the case of Chala, they would say exempt, since it was mixed when owned by an Ovid Kochavim. And the reason for the distinction would be as follows, Hasam hu dechsiv degoncha yiseir over there, meaning by Trumas and Maisers it says degoncha, it's an extra degoncha, it says it twice. Have a miyot achar miyot, that's an exclusion following an exclusion. V'ein miyot achar miyot ela l'rabos, and the rule is if you have an exclusion following another exclusion, that actually is an inclusion, and that would mean afilu ovdei kochavim, that would mean even if the pile of grain is smoothed over when it's owned by an ovid kochavim, there you have a specific inclusion. Aval hacha, but over here when it comes to the isa, when it comes to the dough, the chiyav of chala, trei zimni arisosechem ksiv, it says arisosechem, your dough, it's written twice. Chad arisosechem, now one of the arisosechem, that means kedei saschem, the amount of your dough, the amount that's chayiv and chala, is the same amount as the mon which fell, which is an omer, which is an asiris or efa, that tells you the amount of dough that's chayiv and chala. The chad arisosechem, and then one time it says arisosechem, what does it mean? It means velo isas ovdei kochavim, velo isas hektish, it means not the dough of ovdei kochavim and not the dough of hektish, meaning to say, everybody would agree, even Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda would agree, when it comes to Gilgul Ovid Kochavim, that does exempt. Odilmor, maybe Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon Katani, maybe this Mishnah in Chala is only following Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Shimon, the Kapatri, because they're the ones that exempt when it comes to the Meiruach Ovid Kochavim, when the pile of grain is smoothed out by when it's owned by Ovdei Kochavim, they say it's Potter from Trumas and Maisers, and they would say the same thing when it comes to Chala. Avol Rabbi Meir of Rabbi Yehuda, and according to this understanding, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, who they say Chayiv in the situation of Trumas and Maisers, they would say the same thing by Chala. Gomri, Rashis, Mehasam, they would learn Exer Shava, Rashis from over there, we would learn just like by Trumas and Maisris, there's no exemption, so too when it comes to Chala. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Yehei Rava, Da'achse Bechilma, it should be the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that I should see the answer to this question in a dream. But then Hadar Amar Rava, but then Rava said, Man da Amar Meiruach Ovid Kochavim Potter, the one who says that the smoothing out of the pile of grain, and when it belongs to an Ovid Kochavim is Potter, is exempt from Trumas and Maisris, would say the same thing by the dough. Gilgul Ovid Kochavim Potter would say that Gilgul Ovid Kochavim, the mixing of the dough, when it's owned by an Ovid Kochavim, is also exempt. And Man da Amar Meiruach Ovid Kochavim Eino Potter, the one who says that the smoothing out of the grain when it's in the possession of an Ovid Kochavim, it's not exempt. Gilgul Ovid Kochavim Eino Potter. The same would be true by Gilgul Ovid Kochavim. In other words, Rava says it's the exact same Machlokes Tanoim. And Rashi explains, Hasam over there, Hainu Taima de Meiruach Ovid Kochavim Eino Poter. The reason why Meiruach Ovid Kochavim, if the grain is smoothed out, that pile is smoothed out when it belongs to the idolater, it's not exempt. Mishum de trade de goncha ksivi, because it says de goncha twice. Techsiv lo sucha lechol b'sharecha masar de goncha, it says de goncha over there. Uchsiv, and it's also written v'yachalta lefnei masar de goncha, it says de goncha over there as well. Uchsiv reishis de goncha, it's actually written a third time, some change of the girsa in Rashi that it's not de trade de goncha, it's actually a total of 3 times. It says degoncha, it says reishis degoncha, and chad lemelach diguncha velo digun hektish. One of them teaches us that it doesn't apply if it's owned by hektish. Meiruach hektish, meaning to say again that by meiruach hektish there's an exemption. Ayaser lu trade degoncha. Now we have 2 more degonchas. Lamai digun ovid kochavim. Those would be to exclude digun ovid kochavim, but that's have a digun ovid kochavim miyot achar miyot. That's an exemption after an exemption. The trey kroy mematile. If you have 2 psukim that exempt it, the rule is 2 exemptions is actually an inclusion. Digon Ovid Kochavim, the Chayiv, and that would mean Digon Ovid Kochavim is actually Chayiv. The grain of Ovid Kochavim is Chayiv. Vikasha, now if you're going to ask the following question, My Chazis de Marbis L'Digon Ovid Kochavim, Rabbi L'Hektish, why do we see fit to say that Digon Ovid Kochavim, that's included in Chayiv, and Hektish is excluded, that's exempt? Why would we know to say that? Tarts, we can answer as follows, Mistabra Ovid Kochavim Havalei L'Rebuye. It makes sense to say that the Ovid Kochavim is included. Shekein Nechel below Pidyon Kashal Yisrael. There's no redemption needed, just like a Yisrael. That's not true by Hektish. By Hektish, redemption is needed. And then the Gemara suggested maybe the halachas when it comes to Gilgal Ovid Kochavim and when it comes to Meiruach Ovid Kochavim are the same because Reishis. We learn a Gzer Shav of Reishis. It says Reishis de Goncha, Reishis Arisosechem. It says Reishis de Goncha. That's what it says by the grain, by the Trumas and Maisrus. And it says Reishis Arisosechem, the first of your dough, by the Chala. Malahalan Meiruach Ovid Kochavim lo pater, just like Meiruach Ovid Kochavim does not exempt, again, according to the opinion of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, the Marbinon law mimiot achar miot, because again, we say that there's an inclusion based on the exemption after the exemption. Af Gilgal Ovid Kochavim eino poter, so to Gilgal Ovid Kochavim will not exempt. And the Gemara continues, Eisvei Rapapa l'Rava. Rapapa asks Rava a question from the following brisa. Again, Rava is saying that the halacha by Chala, the machlokas tanoim by Chala, is the same exact machlokas tanoim that we already find by Trumas and Maisrus. The brisa says as follows, Ovid kochavim shefresh peter chamor, and Ovid kochavim he separates a firstborn donkey. We'll see Rashi and Tosas in a moment exactly what that means. The Chala, or separates Chala, modiyamo soshu pater. We let him know that since he was an Ovid kochavim at that time, there's an exemption. V'chaloso nachelas lazarim, and therefore the chala can be eaten by non-kohanim. Upeter chamor gozes v'ovid bo, and the peter chamor, one can shear it, one can work with it. And so clearly over here there is an exemption of ovid kochavim when it comes to chala. Now we know for certain that there are some tanoim that say that exemption, but according to Rav, it's only the tanoim that say that there's an exemption by truma would say that there's an exemption by chala. The question is in this brisa, is it those tanoim or is it all tanoim? And so the Gemara infers, Rapapa infers from this brisa that here we're talking about Peter Chamor, we're talking about Chala, there's an exemption, but Hatrumaso Asura, but it sounds like the Truma of an Ovid Kochavim, that is forbidden. It sounds like there's no exemption when it comes to Truma. It sounds like this brisa is actually making a distinction. Here we have a Tana that says Meiruach Ovid Kochavim, if the pile of grain is smoothed out when in possession of an Ovid Kochavim, it is not exempt. Yet, the Gilgal Ovid Kochavim poter, yet when it comes to Gilgal Ovid Kochavim, the mixing of the dough of the Ovid Kochavim, there is an exemption that goes against Rava. That's essentially saying that when it comes to Gilgal Ovid Kochavim, everybody agrees that there's an exemption. And the Gemara continues along the same lines. V'od esvei Ravina l'Rava. Furthermore, Ravina asks Rava the following question: Chalas Ovid Kochavim ba'aretz, the chal of an Ovid Kochavim in Eretz Yisrael, utrumazo b'chutz la'aretz, and truma in chutz la'aretz. Now, truma in chutz la'aretz is only a derabanan; it's not a doraisa. So there we can be more lenient. So again, modino soshu pater, we let him know that there's an exemption. Again, that's the exemption of Ovid Kochavim, and chalaso nechelas lazarim, the chala can then be eaten by non-kohanim. Utrumaso eina midamas, the truma is therefore, since there's an exemption, it's not going to be truma, and it's not going to be midamas, which means that if it gets mixed up in chulin, it's not going to cause any prohibition. And again, we can make the same kind of inference. This is only by truma of chutz la'aretz that we're lenient. Hatrumaso ba'aretz asura umidamas, but if it would be truma in Eretz Yisrael, which is a doraisa, so then it would be forbidden. It would create a situation where if it mixes with chulin, it's going to create a prohibition. And so again, we seem to have a Tana that makes a distinction between challah and truma. Again, here we have a Tana that says meiruach over kochavim when it comes to the smoothing out of the pile of grain by an over kochavim. So then eino poter, there's no exemption, we're strict. And yet gilgul over kochavim poter. Yet when it comes to the mixing of the dough over kochavim, we say poter. Again, that seems to go against Rava. It's not the exact same machlukas tanoim. Rather, even according to the Tana that is strict when it comes to truma, is going to be lenient when it comes to challah. And the Gemara continues and answers for both of these brisas. When these brisas are strict when it comes to truma, it's not strict on a doraisa level. It does not go against what Rava is saying. It's just midrabanan. Here we're just saying that we're being strict on a derabanan level when it comes to meiruach over kochavim. According to the Tana of these brisas, again, it's not that we're making a distinction between truma and challah on a doraisa level. It's just on a derabanan level we're going to be strict by meiruach over kochavim. And the reason for that is gezeira misham baalei kisim. The reason for that is it's a gezeira, it's a decree because of baalei kisim, which means wealthy individuals. We'll see Rashi in a moment. And Rashi explains, first we have the brisa of shehifresh peter chamor, the person separated a firstborn donkey. Now Rashi understands this to mean shehifresh sel lepidyon peter chamor, that he separated a sheep which is going to be used to redeem the firstborn donkey. Shenolad lo bios over kochavim. This all happened, it was born to him when he was an over kochavim, when he was an idolater. And Tosas over here say, Ovid kocham shehifresh peter chamor perish bekuntra shehifresh seh. Rashi says we're talking about a sheep being separated. Because that's difficult. Afilu b'shel Yisrael leka misham kedusha. The seh, even b'shel Yisrael, even if it was of a Jews, there's no holiness. The chulin gemurin, that it has a status of regular chulin. Utzanan beperakama de bechoros. We have a mission in the first parak of bechoros. Via mace that if it dies neninbo, one can get benefit, and that clearly is not the case of what's going on in this brisa. Elavada bepeter chamor gufei mairi. So therefore, Tosas say we're talking about the firstborn donkey itself, Ki Rabbi Yehuda, and we're following the Tana Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanya Parakama de Bechoros Peter Chamor Aser Bahana Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. It says in the first parak in the Bryce and Bechoros that the firstborn donkey is Aser Bahana according to Rabbi Yehuda. And Rashi continues and says V'chala meisa shegilgala biyos ovid kochavim. Again, a case of chala from dough that was mixed when he was an ovid kochavim before he converted. Hatruma so asura. We can make an inference from the Bryce that truma we'd be strict. That's Aser. Demei rucho eno pater. There's no exemption if the pile is smoothed out while it belongs to an ovid kochavim. Like we said earlier, it's an inclusion based on the double miyat. Chalas ovid kochavim ba'aretz, and then when it comes to the chal of ovid kochavim in Eretz Yisrael, kolomar, what that means to say is afilu mitvu hagdela ba'aretz, even from the grain that grew in Eretz Yisrael. Utrumaso mitvu as chutz la'aretz, and the truma, the leniency is just by the grain of chutz la'aretz. Dafilu gabi Yisrael lo have elam midrabon, and there even by a Jew, it's only chayiv on a drabonin level. And then we can infer hatrumaso ba'aretz, but if it was in Eretz Yisrael, kilomar michlal, meaning to say this implies the trumaso ba'aretz midamas. If it was true in Eretz Yisrael, it would create a prohibition. The meiruach ovid kochavim poter, the smoothing out of the pile while it belongs to an ovid kochavim, does not exempt afagav de gilgulo poter mechal, even though the mixing of the dough does create that exemption by challah. V'kasha l'Rava, this is difficult to Rava. Damar man de mechayev b'truma, mechayev b'chal. He says the one that says chayev by truma, the one that's strict by truma, would be strict when it comes to challah. And the Gemara then answered midrabanan. This strictness by truma is just a derabanan level. Kilomer means to say liolam hadakatani lagabe chala gilgul poter. When it says that by chala the mixing of the dough, if it belongs to an ovid kochavim, is exempt, hanach tanoihi de patri leil. That's the same tanoim that said exempt b'meiruach. It's the same tanoim that said exempt earlier by the smoothing out of the pile by trumas and meiser. So that all aligns. V'hadakatani leil midukya hatrumasu asura. When we make an inference that truma is asur in these brises, midrabanan have asur. That's just asur on a derabanan level. And what's the reason for the Yisra on a derabanan level? Gezeira mishum baalei kis, and it's a decree because of the wealthy. Rashi has two explanations. Ashirim shalochin tvua mechamorim v'shars lokeach min over kochavim shalo ye'aser. It's talking about a situation of wealthy people. They buy the grain from the donkey drivers. Now, if you're going to say that if it's bought from an ovid kochavim that it's not chayiv to meiruach ovid kochavim poter, that the meiruach ovid kochavim exempts asi lamei marnami, they're going to come to say also lokeach mechamer Yisrael poter. One who buys from a Jewish donkey driver is going to be poter. And there is some question as to the proper girsa of Rashi. We'll take a look at Rabbeinu Gershom, seems to say along the same lines as this first explanation of Rashi. Liolam kasavar de meiruach oved kochavim nami poter. Really, he holds that meiruach oved kochavim is also exempt. V'hadamar hatruma baritz asura medamas midrabanan. And again, when we're saying from this brisa that the truma is asur, that's just a drabanan level. Midrabanan he asura. That's why it's asur. Gezeira mishum bali kis. And again, it's a gezeira for the wealthy. And the Rabbeinu Gershom explains bnei adam ashirim shalochin tfua meoved kochavim. We're talking about wealthy individuals. They buy grain both from idolaters and from Jewish people. Now, if we're going to say that one who buys from an Oved Kochavim is exempt, to Meiruach Oved Kochavim Poter, that the Meiruach Oved Kochavim is Poter, Zimnin Dezavin Mi Yisrael Dechayiv Meiser. Sometimes he'll buy from a Jew and it will really be Chayiv. V'omar Me Oved Kochavim Zavin, but he'll claim it was from an Oved Kochavim. Otzvuah Shagadla B'Sadeu Yomar De Me Oved Kochavim Zavna Kadei Liftor, or even if it grew in his field, he'll say that he bought it from an Oved Kochavim in order to be exempt. So that's the reason for the Gezeira. And Rashi continues with a second explanation, Lishnachrin, another explanation, Misham Balei Kisim, because of the wealthy, Sheyesh Len Karkos, however, they have a lot of land, V'chasam al Rov Meisers, and so therefore they don't want to give so much Meiser, they're trying to look for ways to get out of it. V'yiknu Lov de Kochavim, V'yamrichum of de Kochavim, and so therefore they transfer ownership temporarily to the non-Jew, and it's smoothed out in the possession of the non-Jew, Umifka Levi Meiser, that's a way of getting out of the obligation of Meiser, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Zayin Amid Beis.